What would church look like, feel like, be like if there was no building? Could that be the question that God is asking us to wrestle with these last several months of distancing and separation and the next several months, our immediate future? One of our oldest members said, if we can't gather until Christmas or Easter, will there be anything left? Another said, how can we possibly grow if we're not inviting people into our building? Maybe church without building would look a lot like church in the day of Paul. Along a river in Philippi. In the jail there. In the Areopagus in Athens. At the edge of a synagogue in Corinth. Along a trail. Wherever Paul encountered people, church happened. Maybe church would look a little bit like the days of Jesus in Peter's house in Capernaum, at a well in Sychar, in the temple courtyards in Jerusalem, on a hillside overlooking the Sea of Galilee, among the olive trees in the Garden of Gethsemane. Truth is, church happens wherever God is encountered. The fords of the Jabbok, like last week. A middle of nowhere place that Jacob called Bethel the week before. Wherever we stumble across God, wherever there is faith and trust, the church exists, because discipleship, this journey of faith that is all about learning to trust God, one another, and to some extent, ourselves. Paul's reflecting on that as he's writing to the Romans. Just before we begin, he has made a statement. The law ends as Christ comes into the world. The law, which was always intended to provide boundaries and to call us to make decisions, gives way to a ministry about relationship and invitation, about trusting and hoping and loving, about faith. Paul says, think about it. Faith is not about climbing to the heavens in our search for God. Faith is not about descending to the underworld to see if Jesus, who once lived among us, might be there. Discipleship is about encountering God in Christ in the midst of everyday life. Discipleship is about trusting God, trusting others, trusting ourselves. It's about faith, he says. Remember what Moses said. Moses, who gave the law, Paul says. His words about height and depth and a search for God, after all, come out of his farewell sermon. That's what Paul knew his listeners would be drawn toward when he shared those words with them. Moses says, I'm 125 years old. My time is coming to an end. They were gathered in the heights overlooking the Jordan River. The promised land stretched out before them. And Moses says to them that day, I'm calling you to make a decision. Let God lead your way or not. But know this, that the path God has set before you is all about learning to trust, to believe, to embrace this God who has led us from Egypt to the edge of the promised land. This is the God who will lead you into that promised land and the future that God has always dreamed might be yours. Discipleship is about trust, faith, decision. Jesus had had more than a day of it. Early that morning had come news that his cousin John, who baptized him, had been killed by King Herod. He withdrew, looking for a place to just ponder and search and share with God his heart and his sadness. But the people follow him, and so that day is filled with ministry, healing. And it comes to an end with a feeding, an impossible possibility that I shared with you last week. Well, when everyone has had enough and the leftovers had been gathered and they were more than the disciples started with, Jesus does dismiss the crowds. He puts the disciples in a boat, sends them across the Sea of Galilee. He stays behind. Finally, time alone with his God, with his Father. Time alone to renew and refresh and reflect. But now it's early morning, and the disciples have been struggling most of the night against a heavy wind, headwind, making forward progress very difficult. And the waves battering the boat had to be challenging. I remember one middle of the night journey years ago when I was at Twinlow. Staff party, end of the summer. We were out on Lake Pend Oreille and decided to make a trek up towards Sandpoint, have dinner at a restaurant there, and the way home was late that night and the wind picked up and the waves splashed over the bow of the pontoon boat. As we made slow and steady progress, we wondered, are we going to make it? The disciples must have been wondering. Jesus comes walking across the water and they are frightened when they see something out there, not knowing who it is. Peter says, if it's you, Lord, because Jesus has said, it's just me, don't be afraid. Peter says, if it is you, Lord, bid me to come to you. And Jesus says, well, come on then. And Peter is over the side of the boat, stepping across the water towards Jesus, when his attention is drawn not to Jesus for a second, but to the waves and the wind and the precariousness of his position. And he begins to sink. But there is Jesus' hand. Discipleship is about learning to trust. Discipleship is about faith. Discipleship is about making decisions. And sometimes we think ill of Peter for his attention being drawn to the waves, but Peter's the only one out of the boat. And Jesus is there. What must his hands and arms have felt like as they raised Peter up out of the water. Secure, loving, encouraging. I read this week that tent making is at an all-time high among children who are homebound during this pandemic. And I can remember as a kid, that was one of our favorite little games from time to time, to take some blankets out of the closet and stretch them over the table and find some pillows and other blankets and curl up inside the tent and feel secure and warm and loved. It's at an all-time high. One author I read said that they actually bought a little tent that they could put up in the living room so that they could save the blankets for their beds. It's a time of uncertainty and concern, and who can blame children for looking for a place to cocoon, to gather in, to seek comfort. But maybe that's what we as a church have been doing with our buildings all along, when discipleship is not about cocooning. And in this day in which we're in, it needs to be all about what it was all about in the days of Paul, in the days of Jesus, about the people that we encounter. The trust, Paul says, that's on our lips. What are we saying about our relationship with God in Christ? The trust, the faith that's in our heart, is it spilling over into our lives? Discipleship has always been about trust, faith, about decision, about a God not somewhere that we need to go to search for, but nose to nose, present with us wherever we find ourselves, like Jacob at the fords of the Jabbok, like Paul on his way to Damascus, like those who gathered along the river in Philippi, or joined Paul and Silas in prison in that community, those who listened to him in Athens, or gathered with him on the edge of a synagogue in Corinth. Discipleship is all about trust and decision. So what's in your heart as we gather today? What do you find passing through your lips as you make your way through week after week after week of challenge? What would the church be like without a building? People encountering people with God's good news. One hungry person sharing with another the place they can find bread. Discipleship. Discipleship is all about trust, faith, and decision. Paul says it's about that which abides in your heart. It's there on your lips. It's an encounter with God who is everywhere we look, anywhere we find ourselves. And the sharing of the joy that this relationship with God in our midst has created for us. Well, that's always been at the center of discipleship's journey. So wherever this week takes you, whoever crosses your path, Think about what your heart is feeling. Listen for what your lips are saying. Discipleship is about trust. It's about faith. It's about encountering God in our midst. Wherever this week takes us, with whoever crosses our path. Thank you.